Expressions in After Effects can feel like you're trying to learn a second language just to move a layer. But you don't need to have a degree in computer science just to build better rigs. In this series, we're breaking down expression controls, those simple sliders and checkboxes that turn a messy timeline into a professional workflow. Let's get into it.
For the first video in this series, we're going to take a look at the slider expression control, and we're going to do that by building a control panel for everybody's favorite expression, the wiggle. This will allow us to animate the properties in the wiggle, and in this particular case we're going to drop the slider control right on the layer itself, and that's because we want to control only what's on this layer. If you're ever building a bigger rig and you want to control multiple layers all in one place, you'll want to create a controls layer, and that's something that we'll go over later in this series. But in this case, we're going to need two copies of the slider control. So we're going to drop both onto the wiggle layer, and we need to rename each one of them. Now the two properties for wiggle are frequency and amplitude, which you can also look at as speed and strength. I think speed and strength make a little bit more sense when you're just looking at them, so we're going to use those names. So let's click on the first one, press enter to rename it and call it speed. Click on the second one, press enter to rename it and call it strength. Feel free though, if you want to name those frequency and amplitude, it'll work the same way. Then we're going to come down to the position property on our text layer, and we're going to hold Alt or Option and click on the stopwatch to create an expression. And we're going to type wiggle, open parenthesis, and then this is where we can use the pick whip to come up to our sliders. The parameters in the order that they are placed in the wiggle expression are frequency and then amplitude. I never remember that. I always have to look it up. It would be a lot easier if it was amplitude and frequency, because then it would be wiggle AF, which is kind of funny, but unfortunately that's not the way. So we're going to make sure the cursor is inside the parentheses, and we're going to grab the pick whip, and we're going to come up to our speed, because that's the frequency. And then we're going to put a comma and make sure that the cursor is right after the comma. We're going to come back up to come back down to the pick whip and bring it down to the strength slider. And since it's only one line of code, you don't need to close it with a semicolon, but it's good practice to always do it. So let's go ahead and add our semicolon, click away, and if we push play right now, nothing happens, and that's because our sliders are both set to 0. So if we come up and increase, we'll say 5 and 14 or 12. Now if we push play, we've got a wiggle. Now if all you wanted was this exact wiggle, you could obviously just type wiggle, open parenthesis 5, comma 12. But the advantage of doing this, like I said in the beginning, is that we can now animate this property. So if we want our wiggle to be non-existent in the beginning, we can come 0 both of these out, and we can add keyframes, and then we can come to the 5-second mark, and we can increase these each to 10. Now, if we bring our playhead back to the beginning and press play, you see we start with no wiggle, and then wiggle gets into a little frenzy. Now there's one more thing that's important when you're using the slider, and that is setting its range. If you notice right now, if I come up to the speed, I can drag that down to a negative value, which doesn't completely make sense. It will still work, but there may be cases where you don't want a slider to exceed or go below a certain value. So the way that you do that is come up to the slider you want to set the value on, and don't click on the name of it, but right click on the actual part that says slider and click edit value, and then we can give it a range. So we can say we want this slider to go from 0 to 100. Now when we open up the slider, you'll see if I bring the slider all the way to the left, it's 0. If I bring it all the way to the right, it's 100. I can still go to those negative values by grabbing the number and bringing it lower. I can still go above 100 by grabbing the number itself and bringing it higher. But if you want to set the actual values of the slider so that if you or whoever you're building this for can only go within those values by using the slider itself, then that's the way that you do that.
If that tip just saved you an hour of manual keyframing, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future content. It really helps the channel as we grow. Thanks for watching, stay creative, and let's go make some motion.